In 1913, the final inspection crews moved through Kykuit's lower levels with lanterns and clipboards. 7 years of construction, finally finished. The Rockefeller family, 4 generations of them, eventually, was about to call this hillside home. Most of the corridors matched the plans. Most, not all. Near the western foundation, where the heating lines ran toward the hillside, a foreman's lantern caught something his paperwork didn't mention. Not collapsed, not abandoned mid-build. Finished, stone-lined, level, mortared with the same care as everything around it, leading somewhere the final notes never described. A corridor someone had built, on purpose, and nobody had written down. There's a record office in Tarrytown that still holds Kykuit's original construction files. Working drawings, contractor letters, inspection logs, nobody bothered to digitize because nobody thought they mattered. I wasn't looking for Rockefeller when I found my way into that office. I was tracing utility easements across the lower Hudson Valley, the kind of dull infrastructure history that occasionally turns up something it shouldn't. What turned up was a single line in a 1913 foreman's log, written weeks before the family's final move-in. A corridor found, fully finished, absent from every set of plans filed with the estate office. Not a delay, not an error. A completed structure with no paper trail at all. Kykuit took 7 years to build. Ground broke in 1906. The family settled in during 1913, the same year that log entry was written. John D. Rockefeller, founder of Standard Oil and by then one of the wealthiest men alive, hadn't commissioned a house in any ordinary sense. He'd commissioned a seat, a place built to outlast him. 4 generations of Rockefellers would eventually live within these walls, from John D. himself down through his son, his grandson and beyond, each inheriting not just the rooms, but whatever the rooms were quietly built on top of. The estate sat on a deliberately chosen hill above the Hudson, in a place called Pocantico Hills, a name that meant little outside the family's private holdings, but would come to anchor one of the most documented private residences in American history. Documented, that is, almost completely. Almost is the word that matters here. Almost is where this whole story lives. The archive. Itself. The scale of the estate explains why so much paper survives at all. Kykuit wasn't one building, but an entire managed landscape. Formal gardens, a coach barn, greenhouses, a powerhouse, miles of carriage roads cut and graded by hand, and beneath all of it, a mansion that had already been rebuilt once after an earlier version proved unsatisfying to the family, and was substantially reworked between 1911 and 1913. Every phase of that work generated its own paper trail, contracts, payment ledgers, tracking wages down to the day, correspondence shuttling between the family's office in Manhattan and the site superintendents on the hill. The estate office didn't just build a house, it built an archive alongside it, almost as thorough as the construction itself. The drawings tell their own story of revision, and it's a messier story than the finished house ever lets on. Heating plans alone exist in at least 4 distinct versions across the construction period, each one stamped with a different date, each correcting some flaw the previous version hadn't anticipated. Drainage routes shift twice in the surviving paper. Once after a spring flood exposed weaknesses in the original grading, and once more after the 1911 rebuild altered the mansion's footprint enough to require new utility runs entirely. This is what a large, evolving construction project looks like on paper. Messy, iterative, full of crossed-out lines and revised dates. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of paper trail in which a single missing notation could plausibly vanish without anyone noticing. So when the foreman's lantern caught that passage near the western foundation, his first assumption was the obvious one, the practical one, the one any experienced man on a job like this would reach for first. An early draft, maybe. A corridor sketched in an earlier phase and never demolished, because demolishing finished stonework costs money nobody wants to spend twice. Projects of this scale generate a constantly shifting set of blueprints. Heating systems redesigned mid-build, drainage rerouted after a wet spring, exposed a flaw in the grading. A finished corridor that didn't match the final notes wasn't strange on its face, it was almost expected. Paper falls behind the work it's supposed to describe, especially on a project that ran the better part of a decade, where the people drawing the plans and the people pouring the stone were rarely standing in the same room. The foreman noted it, marked his own copy in the margin, and moved on to the next corridor on his list. No reason yet to think otherwise. The estate office's master plans made no mention of the corridor at all. not crossed out, not labelled obsolete, not flagged for later review. Simply absent, as if it had never been drawn in the first place. That distinction meant nothing in 1913. A missing notation on one set of plans, when a dozen other sets existed across different offices and contractors, was the kind of clerical gap that happened constantly on a project this large. Nobody flagged it. Nobody needed to. The work simply went on, the way work always does. What the log doesn't say, what makes that log entry worth returning to, more than a century later, is what it doesn't say. The foreman described the passage in plain practical terms: stone-lined, dry, level, finished to the same standard as the rest of the lower service level. He gave its rough location relative to the heating plant. He noted, almost as an aside, that it ran toward the hillside rather than toward any other part of the house. He recorded its approximate width, its ceiling height, even the condition of the stonework, the same level of mundane technical detail he gave to every other corridor he inspected that week. There's nothing in the tone of the entry to suggest he found it remarkable. That, in its way, is the strangest part of the whole record. A man trained to notice when construction doesn't match its plans noticed this discrepancy, wrote it down in the same flat voice he used for everything else, and never circled back to it. No exclamation, no underline, no note to a supervisor asking what should be done, just another line in a long column of lines, and then the entry ends, mid-thought almost, as though the next line, wherever it might have led, was never written down at all, or was written somewhere that didn't survive into the file I was reading. Kykuit's paperwork, otherwise meticulous to the point of recording individual cartloads of stone, fell silent at exactly the point where this corridor was concerned. No follow-up inspection note references it again. No later correction or clarification appears anywhere else in the foreman's subsequent weeks of entries, even as he continued documenting the same section of the lower level in just as much detail as before. That silence is where the story actually begins. The engineer's notes. The next entry in the file comes nearly 2 weeks later, in a different hand entirely. Not the foreman's careful block lettering, but a quicker, clipped script, the kind a site engineer uses when writing notes for himself rather than for a supervisor. By this point, the lower service level was further along. The heating plant was operational, its pipes finally carrying warmth instead of just promise. The drainage was tied into the main system that would carry water off the hill and away from the foundation. Routine work, the kind that generates pages of unremarkable documentation, the kind meant to be filed and forgotten. And then, in the middle of an ordinary entry about utility access, almost as an afterthought, the engineer mentions a wall, not a new wall, a sealed one. Behind the utility corridor, where a service door should have continued into what the original sketches suggested was additional storage space, there was instead a flat expanse of dressed stone, mortared seamlessly into the surrounding foundation, as though it had simply grown there. At first glance, sealing off unused space wasn't unusual at all. Estates this size routinely closed off sections that proved structurally unnecessary once construction caught up with the household's actual needs. Plans drawn for a future that never quite arrived, quietly bricked over rather than torn out. A storage alcove nobody planned to use, walled off rather than left as dead space, was good practice, not a mystery. The engineer's entry opens with exactly that explanation. He nearly left it there. What stopped him was the mortar. The rest of Kykuit's foundation work, completed under contract with masons brought in specifically for the estate, used a consistent lime-based mix that cured to a particular pale grey, visible throughout every other section of the lower level he'd inspected that month, traceable across nearly every wall he'd had cause to examine since construction began on the hill. This wall's mortar was different, darker, coarser, applied in a style that didn't match the careful, even joints used everywhere else in the building, the kind of work a trained eye notices the way a forger's signature gives itself away under close light. Something subtly off that the hand recognizes before the mind can explain why. Not bad work, he was careful to note. Older work, the kind of masonry technique he associated with structures built a generation or more before Kykuit's own construction had even begun in 1906. He measured the joint width against a section of known 1907 masonry nearby just to be sure, and noted the discrepancy in his log, underlining it twice. The only emphasis he allowed himself anywhere in an otherwise unembellished page of routine notes. He wrote the observation down as a curiosity, then almost immediately moved to qualify it, as if aware the detail might read as more than it was meant to be. Construction sites accumulate odd details, he reminded himself on the page. Older fieldstone surfacing in fresh excavation, recycled brick from some long-demolished outbuilding finding its way into a new foundation. Most of those small mysteries mean nothing at all. It was the kind of self-correction a careful tradesman makes when he catches himself noticing too much. But he didn't cross the observation out. He let it stand, underlined, sitting right beside his own explanation for why it probably didn't matter. The tunnel. But the wall wasn't the only oddity that week, and it wasn't even the stranger one. Following the drainage plans, a route meant to carry runoff from the upper grounds through the hillside, out toward a natural drainage point below, the crew hit a tunnel already cut into the rock, not framed in timber the way new tunnels on the site were shored as a matter of course, not finished with the estate's own distinctive masonry, cut directly into bedrock, smoothed along its walls in a way that suggested deliberate, careful work rather than a natural fissure or fault line. This wasn't a crack the crew had stumbled into, it was a passage someone had made. The engineer checked it against the drainage plans twice, certain at first he'd simply misread the route. Nothing in those plans accounted for an existing tunnel of any kind, in any direction. The plans assumed new excavation, start to finish. What the crew found had clearly been excavated already. Long before anyone connected to Kykuit had broken ground on the hill, the rock face weathered in a way that suggested years, not weeks, of prior exposure before the current dig had ever reached it. Whatever this was, it had been waiting. He brought it to his supervisor, expecting an explanation, or at least instructions on how to proceed. He got neither, not really. The supervisor examined the tunnel himself, walked its length with a lantern held low, ran a hand along the cut stone and said little. According to the engineer's own account, less than a dozen words altogether, which is its own kind of detail worth sitting with. He told the crew to continue the drainage work using the existing cut rather than excavating a new route alongside it. A practical call, on its face, since reusing an existing channel saved time and money on a project already running long, already over budget in places. From a purely operational standpoint, it was the only decision that made sense. Why dig new rock when finished rock already ran in roughly the right direction? But the engineer's final line on the matter carries a different weight than the rest of his clipped practical notes. A weight that seems almost accidental, as though he didn't fully realize what he was writing until it was already on the page. The tunnel's angle, he wrote, didn't match the natural slope of the hill the way a drainage cut normally would. A drainage tunnel follows gravity. It bends with the contour of the land, seeking the lowest available point by the shortest practical route. This one didn't. It ran straighter than gravity required, holding a consistent bearing through stretches where the hillside itself curved away from it. Intentional toward something, he wrote, rather than merely downhill. He didn't speculate further. The entry ends there, mid-thought again, the same way the foreman's had 2 weeks earlier. The next page is given over to an unrelated inventory of plumbing fixtures, as if whatever question that final sentence had raised was simply set aside, left for someone else, at some later date, to answer. Nobody ever did, at least not on paper. The missing page. The drainage tunnel and the sealed wall might have stayed odd footnotes in an otherwise routine construction record. Small, strange details of the kind every old estate accumulates, if not for a piece of correspondence filed separately, tucked into a folder of estate office letters dealing with surveying and land records, the kind of folder a researcher might easily skip past entirely. A short letter, dated a few weeks after the engineer's final entry on the tunnel, written by someone identified only by initials, addressed to whoever managed the estate's documentation at the time. A request so small it almost isn't worth noticing. It references a specific document, a map page, marked in the surveyor's own hand as Pocantico lower line. It asks, plainly and without any apparent urgency, whether a copy should be added to the estate's permanent file, or whether the original should stay with the surveying office that had produced it. A filing question. Nothing more on its surface. The letter itself is unremarkable in tone, brisk, procedural, the kind of internal query estate offices generated constantly about where to store which document, the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. That ordinariness is, in its own way, part of what makes its outcome so striking. Nothing about how the question was asked suggests anyone involved thought they were handling something unusual or sensitive. And yet the answer, whatever it was, left no trace at all, anywhere. No reply survives. No copy of the map page survives either. Not in the estate's records, not in the surveying office's archive, not in the county's historical society holdings, not anywhere across the materials available to me. What survives is only the reference. A single line acknowledging the document existed, and that someone, somewhere, had to decide what to do with it. Whatever decision was made, the result is the same either way. The page that could explain everything found that summer, the unlogged corridor, the mismatched mortar, the bedrock tunnel cut steeper than gravity required, is the one document missing from a file, otherwise so complete it tracks plumbing fixtures by part number, lists every mason's daily wage down to the cent, and itemizes shipments of dressed stone down to the cartload. This is where the story stops behaving like ordinary construction history and starts behaving like something else. Records get lost, of course, paper degrades, filing systems fail, especially across a century of moves and reorganizations and well-meaning archivists doing their best with limited time. That's true of almost any archive a century old, and it would be easy, even reasonable, to write off this missing page as nothing more than the usual entropy of old paperwork. Except the term itself, Pocantico lower line, doesn't read like a label for a drainage route or a property boundary. The two things a lower-level survey page would normally describe. The two things any surveyor on the site would have had occasion to map. A property line wouldn't need its own specially referenced map. That information was already recorded in the estate's land deeds, filed without incident, copied into the county registry, the way every other Hudson Valley property transaction was handled, routine and unremarkable and fully preserved. A drainage route, meanwhile, was handled through ordinary construction documentation, exactly the kind the engineer was already producing in his own clipped hand, not a specialized survey requiring its own correspondence about where, exactly, it ought to be filed. Lower line suggests something else entirely, a boundary, or a route, belonging to a layer beneath the estate itself, a site distinct enough to merit its own document, sensitive enough that someone had to ask in writing what should be done with it, rather than simply filing it where every other survey went without a second thought. Surveyors of the period had standard vocabulary for property boundaries, for drainage easements, for grade lines marking where excavation should stop and the next phase begin. None of those terms appear in the letter, only lower line, undefined, unexplained, as though both the writer and the recipient already understood exactly what it meant, and felt no need to spell it out for the benefit of some future reader they couldn't have imagined. What that layer might have been is impossible to say with any certainty, given what survives. Pocantico Hills, like much of the lower Hudson Valley, carried a long history of use before the Rockefellers ever purchased the land. Earlier farms, earlier property lines long since absorbed into the estate's borders, possibly older surveys conducted decades before construction began in 1906, before anyone imagined a great house on that particular hill. It's entirely possible Pocantico lower line referred to nothing more than a pre-existing boundary survey, the kind of thing a careful estate office would naturally want filed alongside its own records for completeness. And the missing page is simply an accident of poor archiving, nothing more sinister than that. It's equally possible, given everything else found that summer, that the surveyors had mapped something more extensive than a boundary, some existing structure or system beneath the hill predating the estate entirely, that the construction crews had encountered without ever fully understanding what they'd found, and that someone somewhere up the chain had decided was better left undescribed. The unlogged corridor fits the first explanation reasonably well. The bedrock tunnel, cut and finished by all appearances, long before Kykuit's own excavation ever began, fits the second one more easily, more uncomfortably. I can't resolve that tension with what survives in the archive, and I've stopped expecting to. I'm increasingly convinced that's not an accident of incomplete research on my part. It's the shape of the archive itself, thorough everywhere, almost obsessively so except at the one single point where thoroughness would have answered the question outright. Construction logs that track every fixture by part number do not, as a rule, lose track of a structural feature large enough to redirect an entire drainage system. Not by accident, by something else. 4 generations of silence. John D. Rockefeller lived at Kykuit until his death in 1937, walking its halls for over 2 decades without, as far as any surviving record shows, ever once acknowledging what his own construction crews had found beneath it. Whether he knew, whether anyone ever told him, whether the matter simply never rose high enough to reach him at all, there's no way to say from where I sit. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., raised his own family afterward, in rooms built directly above a corridor that never appeared on any plan filed with the estate office, a corridor his own father's builders had found and quietly absorbed into the finished house. His grandson Nelson later used Kykuit as a base during his years as governor and vice president, hosting world leaders in a house whose lower foundation held a sealed wall built with mortar that matched nothing else in the building, a wall every other mason on the site would have recognized as not their own work. 4 generations, by the family's own account, called this hill home. 4 generations who either never knew or knew and said nothing, while the one document that might have explained any of it sat missing from a file otherwise complete down to the last plumbing fixture. It's worth sitting with how long that silence actually lasted, because it's easy to read past it quickly and miss the scale of it. Nelson Rockefeller's tenure at Kykuit alone spanned the better part of 4 decades, decades in which the family commissioned exhaustive histories of the estate, hired professional archivists to organize the very documents I've been working through these past months, and eventually opened parts of the grounds to public tours. Through all of it, the unlogged corridor, the sealed wall, and the bedrock tunnel never surface in any official account of the house's construction, not in the family's own commissioned histories, not in the tour materials handed out at the gate, not in the handful of academic studies of the estate's architecture that exist. If the family knew, they treated it as something not worth mentioning, even when far smaller architectural curiosities elsewhere on the property became cherished, well-documented parts of the estate's public story. That's the part that resists easy explanation, more than any single piece of the puzzle on its own. Not the corridor alone. Finished stonework left out of a construction record is the kind of clerical gap any large project might produce, and probably has, on dozens of estates nobody's ever thought to investigate this closely. Not the sealed wall alone. Closing off unused storage was standard practice on an estate this size, done quietly and without ceremony on job sites everywhere. Not even the bedrock tunnel alone, since reusing an existing excavation to save time and money was, by the supervisor's own decision, simply the practical choice, the kind any foreman would make without losing sleep over it. Each piece, taken individually, sits comfortably inside the ordinary mess of Gilded Age construction, explainable on its own terms, unremarkable in isolation. Set them side by side, though, and the pattern changes into something else. A finished structure with no record of its existence anywhere in the files. A sealed wall built with someone else's mortar, in someone else's style, from a different era entirely. A tunnel that predates the very excavation meant to create it, and the one document that could have tied all 3 of those things together into a single, coherent explanation. Gone. Not lost in any ordinary sense, not misfiled in a box somewhere waiting to be found. Gone, with nothing left behind it but a single letter asking, politely and procedurally, where it ought to be filed. I keep returning in my own mind to that foreman's lantern, moving through the unfinished lower level in the last weeks before the Rockefeller family settled permanently into the home Standard Oil's fortune had built for them. He found something that night that didn't match the plans in his hands, and instead of stopping the work to demand an answer, the project simply absorbed it, the way large projects absorb anomalies, filing them away as curiosities rather than problems, trusting that someone, somewhere up the chain, understood what the rest of them didn't need to. Maybe that trust was justified. Maybe the missing map page really was an ordinary survey, lost the way so many ordinary documents are lost over a century of estate management and shifting archival practice. Not every gap in a record implies a secret hiding behind it. Most don't. But maybe the absorption was the point all along. A project of Kykuit's scale and resources was precisely the kind of undertaking that could close off an inconvenient discovery quietly, finish the work around it without fanfare, and let 7 years of otherwise meticulous documentation close ranks around the one entry that didn't belong. The estate's builders had every reason and every resource to let an unfinished tunnel simply disappear into the ordinary fabric of construction, and just as much reason, if something else really was down there, to make sure it never reached a public set of plans at all. 4 generations of one of America's wealthiest families lived directly above that unresolved question, slept above it, raised children above it, hosted presidents and kings above it, and it never surfaced. Not once, not publicly, in any account of their lives at Kykuit that I've been able to find. The corridor, the wall, the tunnel, and the missing page remain exactly where that foreman's lantern first found them in 1913. Present, finished, unexplained, waiting in the dark under a house that has been written about more thoroughly than almost any other private residence in the country. The hill itself gives nothing away, and that's perhaps the most unsettling part of all. It looks from the outside like every other carefully maintained Hudson Valley estate of its era. Manicured grounds, a great house sitting comfortably on its hill, gardens descending toward the river in disciplined terraces. Nothing about its surface suggests that somewhere beneath the visible architecture, a finished passage runs toward the hillside for reasons no surviving document explains, sealed behind a wall built by hands that weren't the estate's own masons, beside a tunnel cut and smoothed before the family ever broke ground on the project at all. Did Rockefeller's builders simply close off an unfinished service tunnel, the kind of loose end every large construction project leaves behind somewhere? Or did they seal something beneath Kykuit that was never meant to appear on any estate plan at all, something that predated the family's arrival on that hill by a margin none of the surviving paperwork dares to specify? The surviving record was either never equipped to answer that question, or, and this is the possibility that keeps drawing me back to the file, it was never meant to.